So I put it out to YouTube and Discord about what kind of video content you guys wanted to see, and the answer was pretty unanimous. Well, you wanted water cooling or custom loop videos. So here it is. Let's go through some custom loop fittings. Let's do this. This is taking forever. If only organising these shelves would be as fast as the new Lexar NM620 NVMe SSD with read speeds up to 3,300 megabytes a second and write speeds up to 3,000 megabytes a second. That's up to 6 times the speed of a SATA SSD. Available in 256 gig, 512 gig and 1 terabyte capacities, and it comes with a 5-year limited warranty. With this much speed, I feel like I can accomplish anything. That's better. So as I mentioned, you guys asked for more videos on kind of water cooling and custom loop, so here it is. Now I want to go through the most common fittings that you'll actually come across. Obviously there's various different brands out there, AlphaCool, EK, BitsPower, Bixby, Barrow, XSPC and Thermaltake. They're kind of the main ones, but I'm sure there's more, especially in the Asia region. But these are kind of the main ones that you're going to come across if you are looking at sort of starting out with custom loop water cooling. Now, firstly, let's talk about the type of tubing. So to start with, you get soft or hardline. Now, if you're starting out, I'm always going to recommend going soft tubing first, so you can kind of get a feel for the other components in a loop and exactly how they work, like the blocks, the rads, and the pump. If you then decide at a later date, you can always kind of swap the fittings out for hardline fittings. You can invest in the tools and you can start doing a full-on hardline build. Now, remember, for soft tubing, you literally need a pair of scissors or some kind of a cutter like this. Whereas hardline, you're gonna need a heat gun, a reaming tool like this, and much, much more. Now, if you wanna know more on that, let me know in the comments section below and maybe I'll make some videos going into kind of the differences between soft tubing versus hard tubing and the different types. Obviously, there's things like ZMT, PETG, acrylic, glass, copper, brass, and so much more. Now, one thing I will say about tubing, whether it be soft or hard rigid tubing, is that the tubing will come in various thicknesses and will actually have 2 numbers on it, like 10/12 or 10/16. And this implies what the outer diameter is and what the inner diameter is. In some parts of the world, you'd see this in imperial, so you'd be looking at 3/8 and 1/2 inch. Now, this is really down to personal preference. Some people out there, when they are getting into custom loop water cooling, would prefer thinner wall tubing, and some prefer it thick. Ladies. So once you've decided on what kind of tubing that you actually want to go with, you then need to look at fittings, and pretty much there are only really 3 types. There's barbed, compression and hard tube fittings, though you could call them hard tube compression fittings as well, just to confuse you a little bit. Now for clarity, you can get slightly different fittings with kind of a push-in way of connecting the tubing to the fitting, where the fitting has 2 O-rings and you literally push the tubing in to make a seal. Now, you don't typically see these as much, and as far as I know, Barrow are the only ones who actually still manufacture these. And even then, demand for them is kind of dwindling down a little bit. Now, when it comes to barb fittings, they are another one that just aren't really as common as they used to be. They're solely used for soft tubing and are exactly like the name suggests. They have a bit of a barb on them, so kind of like this. Now, anyone who's ever been fishing will know exactly what the meaning of this actually is. It basically has a bit of a stem, like a normal soft tube compression fitting, like this, but without the locking collar to seal or compress it down. Now, on the stem of the fitting, the very end actually protrudes out a little bit so that the soft tubing can't just be yanked off easily. Then, on top of that, you'd clamp it down using whatever way you see fit, whether it be cable ties, union clamps, or something similar, just to stop it working its way off, especially when the system is filled up and therefore adding pressure to the loop. Now, moving on from a barb fitting is a compression fitting for soft tubing. It's basically the same as a barb fitting, but instead of having to use cable ties or clamps, it actually comes with a collar that compresses the tube onto the fitting. So you put the tubing onto the fitting, and it's also worth noting at this point that depending on the thickness of the actual tubing itself, the inner and outer diameter and the difference between it, you may actually struggle to get it onto the fitting itself. Now, thicker tubing generally is actually harder to do this. And a neat simple trick is to use some saliva. Now, I'm not going to show you this on camera because, well, no one wants to see me spitting all over a tube. And I will, I don't know, restrict that to my OnlyFans. Hey, if Linus can do it, so can I. Now, once you do put some saliva onto the end of the tubing, it should simply slide on a lot easier. Now, don't be tempted to use any chemicals like washing up liquid or anything like that, because you may actually mess up the pH balance of your loop. But that's maybe something I'll go into in another video. Now, once you actually have the tubing on the fitting, you can take the locking collar that comes with it, slide it onto the tubing, slide it down, and then simply screw it into place. Now, it won't screw all the way down, but it doesn't really need to. It literally just needs enough to stop the tubing from potentially coming off the barb. Now, one thing you will notice is that when you start to screw it down, the tubing will try and kind of twist ever so slightly. Luckily, because it is soft tubing, you can manipulate it about a bit, but in my experience, think about which way you want the tubing to go before you actually put it on, because the tubing actually comes coiled up when you get it in a pack, so it will naturally kind of try and bend a certain way. Now, I'm a big fan of trying to make soft tubing look like hardline, and with a bit of work and planning of your loop, you can actually make this happen. You're basically aiming for as straight a line as possible. And I guess if you do it right, you can get some really great results. Which kind of moves me on to my next bit. Before we start talking about fittings for hardline tubing, because these next bits actually work on both hardline and soft tubing, well, that's extenders, adapters, and everything in between. So on the end of any kind of fitting, whether it's soft or hardline, is a G 1/4 inch thread. So when you look at your radiator, reservoir, CPU block, GPU block, whatever, you're going to be given the choice of whether you want to use soft tube fittings or hardline fittings, because they will both screw into exactly the same thread. The only difference really is the end that makes contact with the tubing. Because of this, it means you can kind of manipulate your loop to your advantage, even with soft tube fittings. Now, in a perfect world, everything will just simply line up, but sadly we don't live in a perfect world and nothing ever lines up. And this is even more of a case with hardline, but we will get to that in a little bit. Now, the issue with soft tubing is that unless the runs are straight-ish, then you're going to end up getting kinks in the tubing. And much like your garden hose at home, this is a bad thing, as it will simply restrict the flow of the coolant in your loop, and this will potentially lead to overheating. And depending on where the kink is, it could actually lead to your pump running dry. And well, in all honesty, that is a big no-no. Pumps actually use the coolant to spin the impeller, and if they run dry, they will overheat and simply die. Pretty fast too in some of the experiences that I've had. And I've pretty much heard a ton of horror stories about this. So always make sure that your pump is well lubricated. This also applies to other things in life. Lube is good. It's also worth noting that the thicker wall tubing generally will be actually harder to kink. So you have a bit more play in it compared to thin wall tubing. I mean, look at this. It's quite hard to actually kink. Whereas the kind of smaller tubing, I mean, that's very hard to kink. Now, I'm going to stop saying kink before YouTube tries to demonetize this video. Kinky. Okay, I'm done. It's also worth noting that larger tubing doesn't mean you'll get a better flow rate, because you are actually still using the same CPU block or the same G 1/4 inch threaded fittings. So you're actually going to be restricted by that regardless of the tubing. So what if you have a run that you just can't go from the block to the rad in a straight line because of the position? Well, that's where you'd look to use some kind of adapter or extender, or even a combination of the two. Because of the G 1/4 inch thread, you could screw it into the radiator, then put your fitting onto that, so instead of coming straight out the rad, you'd actually be coming out at a 45-degree angle or a 90-degree angle. Or some manufacturers actually make these kind of snake fittings or rotary fittings, which give you the ability to have up to two 45-degree angles. This is kind of more handy in hardline tubing, where lining things up perfectly is, well, it's a must. But if you're after that clean hardline tubing look, while using soft tubing, it can definitely help out there. And as I said, I'm quite a big advocate of trying to make soft tubing look like hardline. Trust me, it just looks amazing when you do it right. Instead of having kind of unnecessary twists and turns and, well, ultimately blocking your components. Because loops, in my opinion, look way better when you're not over kind of shadowing your blocks, your GPU, your memory, and all of your other key important components. So moving on to hardline tubing, or rigid tubing as some would call it, and similar to kind of soft tubing, it comes in different sizes, and really that comes down to a personal preference. Some people prefer a thicker wall, some prefer a thinner wall, and they have their, I guess, pros and cons, mainly when it comes to tube bending. And again, if you guys want to see some more stuff on that in the future, let me know in the comments section below, and yeah, I'll make a video kind of, I guess, going through various different tubing, like I have here, in more detail, and which type and size I prefer and why. Now, when it comes to hardline, you have, well, various different types. So the main types are PETG and acrylic, which again have their pros and cons and have to be cut and prepared in different ways. On top of this, you have chromed copper or chromed brass, which is basically plated so that the coolant makes contact with the copper inside while the outside is nice and shiny. And in some cases, you also end up with anodized tubing, so same sort of principle. This, unlike PETG or acrylic, can't actually be heated up and bent, as the plating would simply crack and it would chip, and so the reasoning behind this is it actually comes in straight lengths as well as 90-degree parts that can be simply cut down. Now, I guess my favorite really has to be this, which this is actually glass. It looks the cleanest, it doesn't cloud or fog up, and it just makes the coolant inside pop, especially if you're using a colored coolant, especially when it comes to like pastel or opaque coolants. Just like the chrome brass, it can't be heated up and bent into shape unless you have access to a kiln laying around, which I'm guessing you don't, and that would actually involve you heating it up to around 1100 degrees Celsius. So again, with that, it comes in straight lengths as well as 90-degree bends. Now, you could always use, I guess, double-ended fittings, like this one, which have a compression fitting built into each end. And you can go for more of kind of an industrious look. And you can actually do the same with acrylic or PETG as well, especially if you're not keen on kind of buying the tools that you need to bend, cut, and everything else. And secondly, actually bending the tubing itself does require, more outlay, more cost, a heat gun, a silicone insert. And if you're not doing it by eye, then well, you're going to need a mandrel to make the exact degree of bend that you're going for. Now, one thing with hard tubing that you will need to make sure is that the ends that go into the fittings are prepared properly. Otherwise, with the way that hardline fittings are, if they have sharp or uneven ends, they firstly won't sit properly, and secondly, they may actually split the rubber O-rings that are inside the fitting. So with that aside, there are a few variations with hardline fittings, and some, in my opinion, are slightly better than others. Now, all hardline fittings consist of rubber O-rings. Now, this is actually what makes the seal between the fitting itself and the tubing. But I've seen it so many times where people have tried to tighten hardline fittings so much that they've actually ended up over-tightening them. And especially with glass or acrylic, they've tightened it so much that the tube actually cracks. Now, you're only actually looking to make sure that the rubber O-rings have made a seal to prevent it leaking. I've seen people post on social media all the time about using pliers or various other tools to over-tighten fittings, which firstly will end up stripping the paint off of the collars or the anodization on the fitting, and it will also lead to potentially cracking the tubing. In all honesty, finger tightening is perfectly fine, and if used with some kind of pressure tester, like this one from EK, you're going to be absolutely fine. Now, not all hardline compression fittings are equal in terms of how many O-rings they have and, well, the general design, but the end result is basically the same. The rubber O-ring or O-rings make a seal and stop any leaks. Now, most hardline compression fittings will have at least 2 rubber seals, one on the inside of the fitting itself and then one on the outside, which sits with the locking collar. And you simply take your tube of choice, so if we go for this one here, and put it on like that. As long as the outer diameter matches the size of the fitting, you're basically good to go. The inner diameter doesn't actually mean anything, as nothing goes inside the tube, unlike soft tubing where the barb sits, well, inside the actual tubing. Now, you'd cut your tubing down using either a saw or a pipe scorer, depending on the type of tubing that you're using, or what I've been using lately, which is a mini cut-off saw, which I picked up on Amazon, and it's been great. I will link to that on Amazon in the description below, and it's been giving me super clean cuts compared to like a mini hacksaw, which in all honesty, it's never going to be perfectly straight when you're using one of them. Now, you then use some kind of a reamer like this to clean up and bevel both the inner and the outer edges of the tube so that it sits nicely in the fitting. You'll kind of feel when it's sitting properly, and away you go. Now, if you don't clean up the edges, as I mentioned, you could end up splitting one of the O-rings. And if it's the inner one, which it likely will be because of the way that the tubing sits, then you'll basically have a duff fitting, and frankly, you'd have to throw it away because the inner O-ring can't actually be replaced. So that's it, throw your fitting away, and that could end up being very, very costly. Now, to save time, but I guess more of an initial outlay, you could always buy a deburring tool to go into an electric drill. So instead of using a reaming tool like this, which admittedly is relatively cheap, you'd actually put the deburring tool into your drill, put it onto the pipe, turn it, job done. And it basically does the same job, but much, much quicker. So you can then put the tube into place, slide the locking collar and the outer O-ring down. And once that's down at the bottom, you can continue to tighten it. Now, once it's tightened, you could actually pull on it slightly to make sure it's made a proper seal if you're that worried. But again, a pressure tester is going to be your best friend here. And it does save quite a lot of time on leak testing with, paper towels, which can take several hours, especially if you want to do a proper job. Now, I generally use a pressure tester for about 15 to 20 minutes. And if the pressure doesn't drop, then you're basically good to go. Now, there is one set of fittings I especially like, and that's the C Pro fittings from Thermaltake. These ones here, which are still a hardline compression fitting technically, but they come in more than 2 parts. So you actually have 3 parts consisting of the fitting itself with a pre-installed O-ring, the locking collar or nut, if you want to call it that, with an outer O-ring, and then you get the inner sleeve, which has 2 pre-installed O-rings inside. So you basically have 4 points of failure, and they couldn't really be simpler to install. So for this, you can actually screw the whole fitting down into place on your rad or block. You can then use the tool that comes included with the C Pro fittings, which basically looks like a little spanner, and you can put that inside and then unscrew the outer collar. You can then take the inner sleeve and the washer off, put the collar and the O-ring and sleeve onto the end of your tubing, line it up and push the collar down and screw it into place. It really couldn't be simpler. Now, the beauty of these fittings is that you don't need to use any force on the tubing itself, which is especially handy on certain components like graphics cards, which will end up putting undue stress on the card itself while in the slot, as you could end up, potentially pushing so hard on the card that you literally snap it off inside your PCI Express slot. Could you think of anything worse? Now, another fitting that's maybe not as common is a bulkhead or a pass-through fitting. And this is basically a way of passing tubing through some kind of a material, whether it be a sheet of acrylic or even the metal on your case. Typically, you'd end up using a step drill bit that matches the size of the bulkhead fitting and drilling a hole into your case or panel, whether this is your PSU shroud, motherboard tray, or anywhere else that you actually want to put it. The fitting then has a collar, which you unscrew, take the fitting and put it in your freshly drilled hole, and you simply screw the collar on from the other side. Now, with these fittings, because they are G1/4 inch again, probably starting to see a little bit of a theme here, you can then put whatever fittings you want on either side. So we can put this extender on this side, and we can maybe put a 45-degree on this side, and your case will literally be sitting in the middle. This is actually great if you want to go for a really clean look on kind of the business side and then go into soft tubing on the back where you won't actually see it, as it will save you doing kind of weird twists and bends using hard tubing. So definitely a kind of favorite way I know of just making things look a little bit cleaner and getting the results that you want. Now, one other thing I want to show you is what I tend to do on pretty much every build that I do, if I can, just for the ease of use and maintenance. Now, as you know, most of the builds that we do here aren't actually built for a very long time, and they normally end up being drained, cleaned up, and the parts put back on the shelf for another build or video. So basically, being able to drain the system quickly and easily is a must for me. And this is where a drain valve comes in. It's a simple kind of tap-like design that has a ball valve inside that opens and closes, and it's really that simple. And because it has a female connector on both ends, you can use a double male fitting, screw it into the drain valve, and simply attach it to the lowest part of your loop, which typically is going to be your pump. So on this one, you have inlets and everything on the top, and then you've also got a spare one on the side. So you can put it into there. And yes, this is a custom loop, so you don't have to worry about having your pump above the rad and blocks, unlike an AIO. Yes, I actually feel like I have to clarify that because I've had those comments before on custom loop builds. Now, what I typically do with my drain valve is to put a stopper on the other end, just to kind of finish it off when I'm not using it. And that's kind of, when I'm not draining my loop. I can make sure that the ball valve is closed, remove the stopper, and attach a soft tube compression fitting along with a decent length of soft tubing, like I have here. Screw that into place, and then I can actually run this off of the desk, so it is at a lower point than the whole loop. Put it into a bottle or a bowl or whatever, open up the valve itself, and then that's pretty much it. You can then look to open any other port, which again, typically on the top of the res, and let science do its magic. It will kind of act like a bit of a vacuum that the air and the gravity will actually push the coolant out. You can then either attach more soft tubing to the port and blow it out, or use a pressure tester to physically push the rest of the coolant out of the system, or just tilt the whole PC depending on how heavy it is, and that's pretty much it. There is a ton of different ways, and again, maybe I'll do some kind of custom loop videos explaining the best ways to drain a system. So let me know if you want to see that. Now, the last thing to go over is the various colors. Depending on the brand, you'll typically find kind of black and silver being the most popular. But brands like EK and Thermaltake and Corsair have actually upped their game a little bit, and now they have the likes of white, rose gold, and so much more. And I guess out of all of them, the one that I like the most is what EK are doing with their latest torque fittings. On both the soft tube fittings as well as the hardline tube fittings, they've implemented a coloured collar that, well, it simply goes over the main part of the fitting. And when the collar comes down, it just leaves a little kind of accent on it. This is great because you can simply unscrew it. And if you want to change up your build without buying kind of different coloured fittings, then this is going to be the way to do it. Because when you think about having at least 8 fittings, so 2 for the RAD, 2 for the res, 2 for a CPU block and 2 for a GPU block, well, it can end up being quite expensive. So this just kind of softens the blow a little bit. And, well, frankly, it can look great and not kind of too in your face. And, well, that's pretty much it, really. So hopefully this video is kind of giving you a better idea and understanding of water cooling and, well, custom loop fittings in general. Which one is right for you and sort of, you know, what one are you going to go with? Soft tubing, hard tubing? Well, that's down to you and personal preference. And as I mentioned, maybe I'll do some more videos like this, going through different types of tubing, different radiators, how to set up a simple loop, and maybe even how to do something a little bit more extreme. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, you know exactly what to do, and I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.